June 22, 1941. The pre-dawn silence across the Soviet Union shattered as 3 million German troops, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft crashed across the border in Operation Barbarossa. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them obliterated on the ground before their pilots could even reach them. Within weeks, the German advance had captured hundreds of thousands of square miles of Soviet territory. The Red Army, caught unprepared despite warnings, reeled backward in chaos and catastrophe. In those desperate early months, as German forces drove deep into Soviet territory and threatened Moscow itself, the Soviet leadership faced an existential crisis that demanded unprecedented measures. Among the millions who volunteered to defend their homeland were thousands of Soviet women, many of them pilots, navigators, and aviation enthusiasts, who had trained in flying clubs across the Soviet Union during the 1930s. The Soviet Union had been unique among major powers in encouraging women to pursue aviation, with hundreds of aero clubs teaching flying skills to both men and women as part of a nationwide program to create a reserve of pilots. When war came, these women immediately volunteered for combat duty, but the Soviet military initially refused them. The idea of women in combat aviation seemed absurd to most military commanders, regardless of the desperate situation. One woman would not accept this rejection. Marina Raskova was already a legend in Soviet aviation before the war began. In 1938, she had set a world record for longest straight-line distance flight by a female crew, flying over 6,000 kilometers from Moscow to the Far East. When her aircraft ran dangerously low on fuel near the end of that record-setting flight, Raskova had bailed out to reduce weight, allowing her 2 fellow crew members to land safely while she spent 10 days surviving in the Siberian wilderness before being rescued. She was a national hero, a recipient of the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, and she had direct access to Stalin himself. In the autumn of 1941, as German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow and the Soviet situation grew increasingly desperate, Raskova went directly to Stalin with a proposal. She would organize and command female aviation regiments that would prove women could fight as effectively as men. Stalin, facing catastrophic losses and needing every possible resource, agreed. On October 8, 1941, Order Number 0099 established 3 female aviation regiments, a fighter regiment, a bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment. These would be the only combat aviation regiments in World War II comprised entirely of women, from pilots and navigators to mechanics and armorers. The Night Bomber Regiment would become the most famous. Initially designated the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, it would later receive the title 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment for its exceptional performance. The Germans would give it a different name, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The sound of their biplanes gliding through darkness toward German positions would become one of the most psychologically terrorizing experiences of the Eastern Front. The regiment formed at Engels, a town on the Volga River, in October 1941. Over 400 women reported for training, ages ranging from 17 to 26. They came from all across the Soviet Union, from cities and collective farms, from universities and factories. Many were students who had learned to fly through Komsomol flying clubs. Others were aviation mechanics, parachute packers, flight instructors. What they shared was determination to fight the invaders and willingness to face any hardship or danger. Marina Raskova commanded the overall group of female regiments, but she appointed Yevdokia Bershanskaya to command the night bomber unit. Bershanskaya, known to her pilots as Dunya, was 29 years old and had years of experience as a flight instructor. She would command the regiment throughout the entire war, from its formation in 1941 until victory in 1945, becoming one of the most successful and longest-serving regimental commanders in Soviet aviation. The aircraft assigned to the Night Bomber Regiment shocked the women who had expected to fly modern combat aircraft. They received Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, two-seat trainer aircraft made of plywood and fabric that had been designed in 1928 for basic flight instruction. The PO-2 was hopelessly obsolete, slower than most automobiles, with a maximum speed of only 94 miles per hour. It had an open cockpit that exposed the crew to temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero at altitude. It carried no radio, no guns for defense, and no parachutes, because there was no room for them in the cramped cockpit. The bomb load was pathetically small, just 220 pounds, carried in racks under the wings. The women looked at these ancient biplanes with disbelief. They had volunteered to fly combat missions against the most powerful air force in the world, and they had been given training aircraft that belonged in a museum. But Yevdokia Bershanskaya understood what others did not yet see. The Po-2's very obsolescence could become its greatest advantage. The aircraft was too slow to be caught by German fighters, which would stall if they tried to match its low speed. It was too small and slow to be easily detected by radar. It could take off and land from the smallest clearings, requiring no prepared airfield. And it was so simple that repairs could be made with wire and fabric even in field conditions. Most importantly, for night harassment bombing, the PO-2 could cut its engine and glide silently toward targets. The Germans would hear nothing until the bombs exploded, and by then the PO-2 would be gone into the darkness. This tactic would become the signature of the Night Witches, a method of attack that was terrifying precisely because it was nearly impossible to defend against. Training began immediately, despite conditions that would have broken less determined people. The women trained through the brutal Russian winter of 1941-1942, with temperatures dropping to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. They lived in unheated barracks, sleeping in their flight suits and boots because there was no time to undress and dress again for the constant training missions. They studied navigation, bombing, formation flying, and the unique challenges of night operations. They learned to maintain and repair their aircraft because there were no male mechanics to do it for them. Every member of the regiment had to master multiple roles. The training was compressed into just 6 months, when normal bomber crew training took years. There was no choice. The front needed them immediately. German forces were advancing, Soviet casualties were catastrophic, and every available unit had to be thrown into combat as soon as possible. The women trained day and night, flying practice missions until they could navigate by the stars alone, dropping practice bombs until they could hit targets in complete darkness, learning to work as crews with absolute trust in each other. Each Po-2 had a crew of 2, a pilot who flew the aircraft and a navigator who handled the bombs and navigation. The navigator sat in the rear cockpit, exposed to the slipstream and the cold, armed with only a map, a flashlight, and a stopwatch. She would calculate the aircraft's position by dead reckoning, counting seconds and estimating wind drift, then tell the pilot when to release the bombs. There were no bomb sights, no sophisticated targeting equipment. Success depended on skill, experience, and steady nerves under fire. In May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was declared combat-ready and deployed to the Southern Front. 20 crews flew their PO-2s to forward airfields near the front lines, ancient biplanes heading into battle against the most modern military machine in the world. The German forces they would face had conquered most of Europe, and were now driving deep into the Soviet Union, their advance seemingly unstoppable. The Night Witches were about to discover whether their obsolete aircraft and improvised tactics could make any difference in this war of annihilation. Their first combat missions began in June 1942, flying from crude airfields that were often just cleared fields a few miles behind the front lines. The missions followed a pattern that would remain consistent throughout the war. At dusk, ground crews would arm the Po-2s with 4 small bombs, the maximum load the fragile aircraft could carry. The women would take off at intervals throughout the night, flying alone rather than in formations, because the Po-2 was too slow and vulnerable to fly in groups that would make them easier to spot and target. The pilot and navigator would fly toward their assigned target, navigating by landmarks when possible, by stars and dead reckoning when landmarks were invisible in darkness. As they approached the target area, often German troop concentrations, supply depots, or artillery positions, the pilot would climb to the maximum altitude their lightly loaded aircraft could reach, typically about 8,000 feet. Then she would cut the engine. In the sudden silence, with only the wind whistling through the wing struts, the Po-2 would glide toward the target. The navigator, watching for landmarks and timing the glide with her stopwatch, would tell the pilot when to release the bombs. The bombs would fall away into darkness, while the Po-2 continued its silent glide. Only when the bombs exploded below would the German troops realize they were under attack. By then, the pilot would restart the engine and climb away into darkness. The tiny Po-2, nearly invisible to searchlights, and nearly impossible to hit with anti-aircraft fire. Then the crew would return to their airfield, land, and immediately prepare for another mission. Throughout the night, each crew would fly 8, 10, sometimes 15 missions, taking off, bombing a target, landing to rearm, and taking off again. Night after night, without rest, the women flew their constant harassment missions, giving German troops no peace, no sleep, no moment of safety. The German soldiers quickly learned to fear the sound that preceded these attacks. Before the bombs fell, in the brief moments when the Po-2 glided overhead, the fabric-covered wings and struts would create a distinctive sound in the wind. A soft whooshing that German soldiers described as similar to a witch's broomstick sweeping through the night sky. That sound, followed seconds later by explosions, became deeply associated with terror and death. The Germans began calling the Soviet pilots Nachthexen, night witches, a name the women would embrace with fierce pride. The psychological impact of the night witches' attacks far exceeded the physical damage caused by their small bomb loads. The constant harassment meant German troops got no rest at night. The unpredictable attacks could come at any moment, from any direction, with almost no warning. Searchlights were largely useless against the tiny, slow-moving biplanes. Fighters were scrambled repeatedly, but rarely caught the Po-2s, which would simply land in any field and hide until the fighters gave up searching. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the Po-2s were so small and maneuverable that they were extremely difficult to hit. German soldiers reported that the stress of the nightly attacks was worse than daylight bombardment from heavy bombers. At least with heavy bombers, you could hear them coming from a distance, take cover, and know when the attack was over. The night witches gave no such warning and no such relief. They appeared from darkness, struck, vanished, and returned again and again throughout every night. Sleep became impossible. Nerves frayed. Troops in areas regularly visited by the night witches showed signs of severe psychological stress. The night witches themselves paid a terrible price for their effectiveness. Flying obsolete aircraft with no defensive weapons, no parachutes, no radios, they were completely vulnerable if caught by enemy fighters or hit by anti-aircraft fire. Their plywood and fabric aircraft would burn instantly if struck by incendiary rounds. A direct hit from anti-aircraft fire would tear the fragile PO2 apart. Engine failure meant a forced landing in darkness in enemy-held territory. The regiment began suffering casualties almost immediately. In their first weeks of combat operations, several crews were lost to anti-aircraft fire and accidents. Night flying in primitive aircraft, with no navigation aids over unfamiliar territory and combat conditions, was inherently dangerous even without enemy action. Add German defenses, and the casualty rate became devastating. Yet every night, the surviving crews continued flying, often taking extra missions to compensate for lost crews. The women developed tactics to improve their survival chances. They learned that German searchlights would sweep in predictable patterns, creating dark corridors that a skilled pilot could exploit. They discovered that if they came in very low, below 500 feet, the anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress far enough to hit them, and the fuse settings on shells were too long to explode at such low altitude. They found that multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously from different directions would overwhelm defenses, with some crews drawing fire while others struck the target. One of their most effective tactics involved 3 aircraft working in coordination. 2 would approach the target area with engines running, drawing searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While German gunners focused on these decoys, the 3rd aircraft would glide in silently from a different direction, drop its bombs, and escape before the defenses could react. Then the roles would rotate, with different aircraft serving as decoys. This required absolute trust between crews and precise timing, but it significantly improved survival rates while maintaining effectiveness. The physical conditions the night witches endured were almost unimaginable. Flying in open cockpits through Russian winters meant exposure to temperatures that could freeze flesh in minutes. The women wore multiple layers of clothing, but at altitude, the cold was so intense that their maps would freeze and become unreadable. Their hands would lose feeling even in thick gloves, and their faces would develop frostbite. Navigators particularly suffered, exposed in the rear cockpit with no windscreen protection, trying to read maps and calculate positions with frozen fingers while the slipstream tore at them. Summer brought different torments. Mosquitoes swarmed the primitive airfields, making sleep nearly impossible during brief rest periods. Dust and heat made working conditions brutal. The women still flew in their heavy winter flight suits because at altitude, even in summer, the temperatures dropped dramatically. They would sweat through their clothes on the ground, then freeze at altitude, then return to sweltering heat, cycle after cycle, night after night. The ground crews, also all women, worked with equal dedication under impossible conditions. They had to arm, fuel, and maintain the Po-2s for continuous operations throughout each night. A typical night might see a crew fly 15 missions, which meant the ground crew had to service that aircraft 15 times in one night, working in darkness or by shielded lights that wouldn't attract enemy attention, often under artillery fire as German forces tried to destroy the airfields. The mechanics became experts at field repairs that kept the aging Po-2s flying despite damage and wear. They would patch bullet holes with fabric, replace damaged struts with wood scavenged from destroyed buildings, use wire to secure damaged components, work through the night to get damaged aircraft ready for the next mission. They worked with minimal tools, no spare parts, and constant pressure, knowing that their work directly determined whether their friends would survive the next mission. Armorers loaded bombs by hand, dangerous work in darkness. The bombs were small, but still lethal if mishandled. Each bomb had to be carefully attached to the racks under the PO-2's wings, fused correctly, and secured so it wouldn't release prematurely. The armorers worked rapidly because each crew would return multiple times per night, and delays meant fewer missions and less pressure on the enemy. The regiment developed an extraordinary esprit de corps. The women called each other by nicknames, shared everything they had, and formed bonds of friendship that would last their entire lives. They celebrated victories together and mourned losses together. When a crew failed to return, there was no time for elaborate grieving. They would hold a brief memorial. Someone would volunteer to take the lost crew's missions for that night, and operations would continue. The dead were honored by the living continuing to fight. By the autumn of 1942, the night witches had become a feared presence on the southern front. German reports from that period specifically mention the harassment bombing and the psychological toll it was taking on troops. Units requested additional anti-aircraft defenses specifically to counter the night attacks. The Luftwaffe assigned night fighters to hunt the PO-2s, though with limited success given the biplane's low speed and ability to land almost anywhere to evade pursuit. The Soviet command, initially skeptical about female combat aviators, began to recognize the regiment's exceptional performance. The night witches were flying more sorties per aircraft than many bomber units using modern equipment. Their morale remained high despite casualties and harsh conditions. Their accuracy in hitting targets without sophisticated equipment was remarkable. In December 1942, the 508th Night Bomber Regiment received Guard status, being redesignated the 46th Taman Guard's Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. This was an enormous honor, recognizing combat effectiveness and valor. The women had proven their worth in blood and perseverance. Among the regiment's most famous pilots was Nadezhda Popova, who would eventually fly 852 combat missions, more than any other pilot in the regiment. She survived being shot down multiple times, including one incident where her Po-2 caught fire in midair. The fabric covering burned away as she struggled to maintain control and make an emergency landing. She and her navigator escaped with their lives, but with severe burns. After recovering, Popova returned to combat flying, refusing to accept any other assignment. Another legendary pilot was Irina Sebrova, who would complete over 1,000 missions during the war, the most of any pilot in the regiment. She flew through the entire war without missing significant time to wounds or illness, an extraordinary achievement given the conditions and dangers. Her skill and consistency made her one of the most valuable members of the regiment, a pilot who could be counted on for the most difficult missions. Yevgenia Zhigulenko flew missions throughout the war and later became one of the few members of the regiment to write extensively about her experiences. Her memoirs provide invaluable first-hand accounts of what it was like to fly those nightly missions, the fear and exhilaration, the losses and victories, the bonds between the women who shared those experiences. The navigators, often overshadowed by pilots in historical accounts, were equally essential and equally brave. Sitting in the exposed rear cockpit, calculating positions by dead reckoning and darkness, while anti-aircraft fire burst around them, required extraordinary skill and courage. Navigators like Rufina Gasheva, who flew over 800 missions and became one of the most decorated members of the regiment, demonstrated that their role was as vital and as dangerous as the pilots. The regiment's tactics evolved as the war progressed, and they gained experience. They learned to vary their approach patterns and altitudes to make defenses less effective. They developed techniques for finding targets in complete darkness, using landscape features, rivers, roads, and settlements as navigation aids. They became experts at weather exploitation, using cloud cover to hide their approach and moonlight to illuminate targets. They learned which German units had the most effective anti-aircraft defenses and developed specific tactics for each type of target. By 1943, the Night Witches were operating across multiple fronts as Soviet forces began their great counteroffensives. The regiment moved frequently, following the advancing front lines, setting up operations at temporary airfields, flying intensively during major operations, then moving forward again. They participated in the battle for the Caucasus, the liberation of Crimea, the battles in Ukraine and Belarus. Everywhere they went, German troops learned to fear the Knights. The spring of 1943 brought the Kuban campaign, where the Night Witches flew some of their most intensive missions. The fighting in the Kuban region was fierce, with both sides committing major forces. The regiment flew nightly harassment missions against German positions, supply lines, and airfields. The operational tempo was relentless, with crews flying up to 18 missions per night during critical phases of the battle. Aircraft were flying so frequently that engines barely had time to cool between missions. During the Kuban fighting, the regiment suffered some of its heaviest casualties. German night fighters became more effective at intercepting the PO-2s, and anti-aircraft defenses were reinforced. Several experienced crews were lost in a short period, devastating losses for the tight-knit community. Yet the survivors continued flying, taking on extra missions to maintain the pressure on German forces. One mission during the Kuban campaign became particularly famous. A PO-2 piloted by Yevgenia Rudneva, with navigator Ekaterina Ryabova, was assigned to bomb a German ammunition depot. They successfully hit the target, causing a massive secondary explosion that lit up the night sky. But the explosion illuminated their aircraft, and searchlights immediately locked onto them. Rudneva performed desperate evasive maneuvers as anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around them. The PO-2 was hit multiple times, but Rudneva managed to escape the searchlights and return to base with her aircraft barely flyable. Both women received decorations for their courage and skill. The summer of 1943 saw the massive Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The Night Witches participated in the defensive phase and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive. They flew missions against German tank concentrations, artillery positions, and logistics nodes. While their small bombs couldn't destroy tanks, they could damage supply vehicles, destroy fuel dumps, and most importantly, prevent German troops from resting at night. German soldiers at Kursk reported that the constant night harassment by the PO-2s contributed significantly to their exhaustion and declining effectiveness. During the Kursk battle, the regiment pioneered new tactics for night attack missions. They learned that attacking German tank assembly areas at dusk, when crews were refueling and rearming their vehicles, could cause fires and secondary explosions that destroyed multiple vehicles. They discovered that bombing crossroads at night could create traffic jams that made excellent targets for follow-up attacks. They developed techniques for finding camouflaged positions by looking for patterns in vegetation and terrain. The autumn and winter of 1943-1944 saw Soviet forces pushing westward across Ukraine. The Night Witches moved with them, establishing temporary airfields in liberated territory, often operating from fields that had been German positions days before. They flew missions supporting river crossings, attacks on fortified positions, and the encirclement of German units. The operational pace remained brutal, with crews flying nightly in all weather conditions. Weather was a constant challenge for the Night Witches. Modern bomber units would cancel missions in poor weather, but the PO-2 regiment flew in conditions that seemed impossible. They flew through storms, through snow and rain, through fog that reduced visibility to near zero. The primitive nature of their aircraft meant they were actually less affected by weather than more sophisticated planes. They could fly below storm systems that grounded other units, navigate by compass and stopwatch when landmarks were invisible, and land in conditions that would have been deadly for heavier aircraft. This willingness to fly in any conditions made them invaluable to ground commanders who could count on night harassment missions, regardless of weather. German troops learned that no weather would provide respite from the night witches. Even on the worst nights, when fog or storms seemed to make flying impossible, the sound of Po-2 engines and the crash of bombs would break the darkness. By early 1944, the night witches had developed into one of the most effective harassment units in the Soviet Air Force. Individual pilots had hundreds of combat missions under their belts. The regiment had established procedures and tactics that maximized effectiveness while minimizing casualties. New crews joining the regiment benefited from the accumulated experience of veterans, learning techniques that took months or years to develop through trial and error. The spring of 1944 brought the liberation of Crimea, operations in which the night witches played a significant role. They flew intensive missions supporting the offensive that would drive German forces off the peninsula. The fighting in Crimea was particularly bitter, with German forces defending strongly before finally evacuating across the Black Sea. The night witches bombed German positions, harassed retreat routes, and attacked evacuation points, adding to the chaos of the German withdrawal. During the Crimean campaign, one crew achieved something remarkable that demonstrated both the Po-2's unique capabilities and the skill of its pilots. Pilot Irina Sebrova and her navigator were assigned to attack a German coastal artillery position that was firing on Soviet ships. The position was heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. Sebrova approached at extremely low altitude, barely above the waves, invisible to radar and too low for the coastal guns. She climbed sharply at the last moment, dropped her bombs directly on the artillery position from less than 200 feet altitude, then dove back toward the sea to escape. The artillery position was destroyed, and the Po-2 escaped undamaged. It was the kind of precision attack that seemed impossible for such a primitive aircraft. As Soviet forces pushed into Poland and toward Germany itself in 1944, the night witches continued their relentless operations. They had now been flying combat missions for over 2 years, an extraordinary length of continuous combat service. Many of the original pilots from 1942 were still flying, now veterans with hundreds of missions, their experience making them incredibly effective. But the war had also taken a terrible toll. The regiment had lost dozens of crews, women who would never see victory, never return home, never grow old with their friends. The memorial culture within the regiment grew stronger as losses accumulated. The women would gather to remember fallen comrades, sharing stories and memories. They kept photographs when possible, wrote letters to families, promised each other to survive and remember. The bonds formed in this crucible of shared danger and shared loss would define the rest of their lives. These were not just colleagues or fellow soldiers. They were sisters bound by experiences that no one who hadn't flown those missions could truly understand. The regiment's operations expanded in scope as Soviet territory was liberated and the front moved westward. They now flew longer missions to reach targets deeper in enemy territory. The Po-2's limited range remained a constraint, but the women learned to maximize every mile. They would fly at economical cruise speeds to conserve fuel, plan routes that exploited favorable winds, and in emergencies, land to refuel at forward positions where ground crews had managed to establish fuel dumps. The advance into Eastern Europe brought new challenges. The terrain was different from the steppes and forests of Russia, with more urban areas, different infrastructure, changing landscapes that required new navigation techniques. The German defenses were also different, with more sophisticated anti-aircraft systems and better coordinated night fighter operations as they fell back toward Germany proper. The Night Witches adapted to each new situation, their accumulated experience and flexibility allowing them to maintain effectiveness. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet Operation Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center in Belarus, one of the most decisive victories of the war. The Night Witches participated throughout the offensive, flying missions that supported the massive encirclements and rapid advances. The operational tempo reached incredible intensity, with some crews flying more than 20 missions per night during critical phases. Ground crews worked to the point of collapse, keeping aircraft flying, rearming and refueling with desperate speed to get crews back into the air. During Bagration, the regiment achieved some of its most impressive results. German reports captured after the operation specifically mentioned the effectiveness of Soviet night harassment bombing in preventing rest and reorganization of retreating units. One German division commander noted in his diary that his troops had not slept through a single night in 2 weeks due to constant Soviet air attacks, primarily by light aircraft, and that this exhaustion had significantly contributed to his division's combat ineffectiveness. The liberation of Belarus in summer 1944 was particularly meaningful for many of the Night Witches. Soviet territory was being freed, cities and towns were being liberated from occupation, and the women could see tangible results of their years of fighting. They flew over liberated areas and saw Soviet flags flying again, people emerging from hiding, life beginning to return. It reinforced their sense of purpose and justified the sacrifices they had made. By autumn 1944, Soviet forces were pushing into the Baltic states and Poland, fighting in countries that had been under German occupation for years. The Night Witches flew missions supporting these advances, bombing German positions, harassing retreating columns, attacking supply lines. They operated from captured German airfields, sometimes flying missions within days of an airfield being secured. The fluidity of operations and the constant movement forward created logistical challenges, but the regiment had become expert at rapid deployment and operating under austere conditions. The winter of 1944-1945 brought operations in Poland and the approach to Germany itself. The women knew that final victory was approaching, but also understood that the Germans would fight most desperately in defense of their homeland. The Night Witches would be needed until the very end. They continued flying through one more brutal winter, their 5th winter of war, still in open cockpit biplanes, still enduring freezing temperatures at altitude, still landing and taking off repeatedly throughout endless nights. One mission during the winter offensive became emblematic of the Night Witches' courage and effectiveness. A crew piloted by Serafima Amosova was assigned to attack a German train carrying ammunition and reinforcements. The target was heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns mounted on railcars. Amosova approached from an unexpected direction, gliding in silently with engine off. She dropped her bombs directly on the locomotive, causing an explosion that set off the ammunition in the railcars. The resulting series of explosions destroyed the entire train and a section of the railway line. Amosova escaped through the smoke and confusion before the German guns could track her aircraft. As Soviet forces entered Germany in early 1945, the Night Witches found themselves bombing targets in German territory, bringing the war to the enemy's homeland. There was a grim satisfaction in this reversal. The Germans, who had destroyed so much of the Soviet Union, who had killed millions of Soviet citizens, were now experiencing war in their own land. The women felt no mercy. They bombed German positions with the same determination they had shown throughout the war, their hatred for the fascist invaders undiminished. The regiment participated in the final offensives of the war, flying missions during the battles for East Prussia, Pomerania, and the final drive toward Berlin. The Germans fought with increasing desperation, making every attack more dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire remained intense until the very end, and German fighters continued operating even as fuel and ammunition grew scarce. The Night Witches continued to suffer casualties even in the war's final weeks, women dying within days or even hours of victory after surviving years of combat. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who had commanded the regiment since its formation, led her women through every campaign from 1942 to 1945. She had maintained discipline and effectiveness while also caring deeply for every woman under her command. She celebrated their victories and mourned their losses. She fought with higher command to get better equipment and supplies. She defended her pilots against accusations that they were not doing enough or flying aggressively enough. She had proven that women could not only fly combat missions, but could do so with excellence that matched or exceeded male units. The statistics of the Night Witches' combat record were extraordinary. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew 23,679 combat sorties. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German targets. They flew more sorties than many bomber regiments equipped with modern aircraft. Individual pilots flew hundreds of missions, with several exceeding 801 pilot reaching over 1,000 missions. They operated continuously from June 1942 until May 1945, nearly 3 years of uninterrupted combat operations. The cost was also high. The regiment lost 32 women killed in action over the course of the war, approximately 12% of those who served. This casualty rate was actually lower than many Soviet aviation units, a testament to the women's skill and their tactics that emphasized survival as well as effectiveness. But each loss was deeply felt in the close-knit community, and the survivors carried the memory of their fallen friends for the rest of their lives. On May 9, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe ended. For the Night Witches, still at their forward airfield preparing for that night's missions, the news brought overwhelming emotion. They had survived. They had won. The years of fear and cold and exhaustion and loss had finally ended. Women embraced, crying with relief and joy and grief for those who hadn't lived to see this day. They had flown their last combat mission, would never again have to climb into a Po-2 and fly into anti-aircraft fire and darkness. The victory celebrations were bittersweet. They rejoiced in the defeat of Germany and the end of the war, but they also mourned their fallen sisters. 32 women who had stood with them at the beginning or joined them along the way would never return home, never marry, never have families, never experience the peace they had fought to achieve. The living made vows to remember the dead, to tell their stories, to ensure their sacrifices were never forgotten. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the regiment remained intact while demobilization procedures were organized. The women lived in a strange limbo, still military personnel, but no longer at war, waiting to learn what would happen to them next. Some wanted to remain in aviation, to continue flying now that they had proven women could serve as military pilots. Others wanted nothing more than to return home, to resume civilian lives, to put the war behind them and try to forget the horrors they had experienced. The Soviet government recognized the Night Witches' exceptional service. 23 members of the regiment received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the highest decoration the Soviet Union could bestow. This was an extraordinary proportion for a single unit. Dozens more received the Order of the Red Banner and other high decorations. The regiment itself received multiple honors and citations. The official recognition validated what the women had known all along. They had fought as courageously and effectively as any male unit, and they deserved equal recognition. However, the post-war years would prove challenging for the Night Witches in ways they hadn't anticipated. Soviet society, despite its official rhetoric about gender equality, remained deeply conservative about gender roles. The women who returned home found that many people were uncomfortable with the idea of female combat veterans. There were whispers and insinuations that women who had spent years in military service must have compromised their virtue. Some faced difficulty finding employment because employers were skeptical that women who had been pilots and navigators could adapt to civilian work. Many of the Night Witches found the transition to civilian life extremely difficult. They had spent years in a community of women who shared extraordinary experiences, who understood each other completely, who had faced death together repeatedly. Returning to civilian society meant losing that community and trying to relate to people who had no concept of what they had been through. How could they explain to someone who hadn't experienced it what it felt like to glide silently toward enemy anti-aircraft fire, to see friends burn to death in fragile aircraft, to fly mission after mission through years of war? Some of the women tried to continue careers in aviation, but the Soviet Air Force demobilized its female combat pilots after the war. There were no positions for women in post-war military aviation. A few managed to find work as civilian pilots or flight instructors, but most were forced to abandon aviation entirely. They became teachers, engineers, doctors, factory workers, anything but pilots. For women whose identity had been forged in the cockpit of a PO-2, this forced separation from flying was a profound loss. Nadezhda Popova, the pilot who had flown 852 combat missions, tried to remain in aviation after the war, but found all paths blocked. She eventually became an instructor at a flying school, teaching others to fly even though she could no longer fly combat missions herself. She married another combat veteran, and they shared an understanding of war that helped them both cope with their experiences. But she never flew another PO-2 after the war, never again experienced the peculiar combination of terror and exhilaration that had defined her youth. Irina Sebrova, who had flown more missions than anyone else in the regiment, also struggled with post-war adjustment. She had survived over 1,000 combat missions without serious injury, only to find herself adrift in peacetime. She worked various jobs, never quite finding her place, always remembering the nights over the Eastern Front when her life had clear purpose and her actions had immediate meaning. Like many combat veterans, she found that peace was in some ways harder to endure than war. The regiment's commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, received the Order of Suvorov, an extremely rare decoration for someone of her rank and especially remarkable for a woman. She attempted to remain in military aviation after the war, but faced the same barriers as her pilots. The Soviet military was not prepared to accept women in peacetime service. She eventually left military service and worked in civilian aviation administration, using her organizational skills and experience in roles that didn't allow her to fly, but at least kept her connected to aviation. For decades after the war, the story of the Night Witches was known primarily within the Soviet Union and primarily among aviation enthusiasts and veterans communities. The women themselves rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. Soviet culture encouraged veterans to move forward rather than dwell on the war, and the women had their own reasons for silence. Many found it painful to remember fallen friends and traumatic experiences. Others felt that no one who hadn't been there could understand anyway. So why try to explain? The Night Witches maintained contact with each other through veterans' organizations and periodic reunions. These gatherings were important for the women, opportunities to be with the only people who truly understood what they had experienced. At reunions, they could speak freely about the war, share memories of fallen friends, acknowledge the continuing impact of those years on their lives. They supported each other through the challenges of aging and the ongoing struggle to process trauma that no one in the 1950s or 1960s understood as PTSD. As the Cold War progressed, occasional references to the Night Witches appeared in Soviet propaganda as examples of Soviet women's contributions to victory. But these references were usually superficial, focused on the novelty of women flying combat missions rather than the reality of what those missions involved. The women themselves were often uncomfortable with propaganda portrayals that glamorized war and ignored the actual horror and cost. It wasn't until the 1980s, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that serious historical attention began focusing on the Night Witches. Historians gained access to previously classified documents, and veterans became more willing to share their experiences. Books and documentaries began telling the story with more accuracy and depth. Western audiences learned about these remarkable women for the first time, and even within Russia, younger generations discovered a part of their history that had been inadequately told. The end of the Cold War allowed for more honest discussion of the war's realities. Veterans could speak more openly about difficult aspects of their service, the inadequate equipment they had been given, the losses they had suffered, the difficulties of being female combat veterans in a society that didn't know how to handle them. The Night Witch's story emerged as more nuanced and powerful than the propaganda versions had suggested. By the 21st century, as the surviving Night Witches reached their 80s and 90s, there was renewed urgency to document their stories before the last veterans passed away. Historians rushed to interview survivors, to record their memories, to preserve this history while first-hand accounts were still possible. The women, now in their final years, were finally given the opportunity to tell their stories fully and have them taken seriously as historical testimony. Nadezhda Popova lived until 2013, reaching the age of 91. Until the end of her life, she spoke about her time with the Night Witches as the most important period of her existence, despite the trauma and loss. She maintained that the women of her regiment had proven that courage and skill had no gender, that women could fight as effectively as men when given the opportunity. She was proud of what they had accomplished, and frustrated that their story had taken so long to be properly recognized. The legacy of the Night Witches extends beyond their immediate military impact. They demonstrated that women could perform in combat roles with distinction, though this lesson was one that militaries were slow to learn. They showed extraordinary courage in circumstances that would have broken many people. They maintained their humanity and their bonds with each other, despite years of violence and hardship. They proved that obsolete equipment in skilled hands could still be effective, that determination and ingenuity could overcome material disadvantages. The Night Witches also represent a broader story about women's experiences in World War II. Across all the combatant nations, women contributed to the war effort in ways that challenged traditional gender roles. But the Soviet Union was unique in allowing women to serve in direct combat positions in significant numbers. The Night Witches were the most famous of the Soviet female combat aviators, but there were also female fighter pilots, female tank commanders, female snipers, female infantry soldiers. These women fought alongside men and proved themselves capable of equal bravery and effectiveness. The story of the Night Witches reminds us that war involves not just armies and strategies, but individual human beings facing extraordinary challenges. Each of those women who climbed into a Po-2 night after night had her own fears, her own reasons for fighting, her own losses and memories. They were not mythical heroes, but real women who found within themselves the strength to do what needed to be done, despite terror and exhaustion. Today, the Night Witches are remembered as pioneers who flew their primitive biplanes against the most powerful military in the world and made a difference. They are honored in museums, memorials, books, and films. Their story inspires new generations to recognize that heroism takes many forms and that women have always been capable of extraordinary courage when given the opportunity to demonstrate it. The sound of a Po-2 engine, the sight of fabric-covered wings gliding silently through darkness, remains a symbol of determination in the face of overwhelming odds, of skill and courage that changed history.